So I met my husband when we were both working as doctors in Inverness, and we lived together for a few years before we got married in 2006. After we got married, one of the things we were really sure about was that we both wanted to have children, and we were very lucky that we got pregnant really quite quickly after we got married. And then in January 2007, we went for our first scan, and we were a bit late having that because we'd just been away on a skiing holiday. So I was almost 14 weeks when I had my first scan, and I still remember very clearly walking across from afternoon. It was Tuesday afternoon. Everything bad happens to me on a Tuesday afternoon. We walked across the meadows together, full of the excitement and happiness to see our first baby. And when we had the scan, the sonographer just said to me, "So have you not had any abdominal pain or bleeding?" And there was a baby there, but there wasn't a heartbeat. And that was our first experience of pregnancy. It was our first experience of pregnancy loss. And we walked back across the meadows, and it started to snow, and the snow was running down our faces, mixing with our tears, and that was our first kind of heartbreak together in a way. We had to go for another scan the next day, and we were lucky in some ways that the baby had died after 12 weeks, so that we were able to have investigations to try and find out why. And we were also very lucky to find out a reason for her dying. It was a little girl. And it was because I'd had a parvovirus infection when I was pregnant. I didn't even know I'd had it, and that was the only symptom I had, was losing a baby. It's not a very common thing to get in pregnancy because most people have it when they're younger, but you can only have it once. So once we knew about that, I was kind of reassured that that was a one-off thing. Although it made me very aware that pregnancy losses happen, it was really helpful to me in terms of getting on with other things, that it was something that could only happen once. After we had her, I remember being given leaflets at the Royal about the Miscarriage Association, and just kind of having them handed to me along with a whole bundle of things, and not really being guided to any particular support. And I didn't really look for support. I kind of pretended to myself it wasn't really a baby, even though it had to be induced and it was a tiny little body. I didn't want to look at it. John did. John saw her body. I didn't want to. And just kind of tried to make myself not forget about it, because you couldn't, but just kind of move on. My desperate thing was to be pregnant again. And when I had the scan, they also saw that I had big fibroids, so there was a bit of an anxiety about whether that would make a difference to being pregnant again. But once we'd had the all clear from that point of view and seen the consultant, I basically got pregnant the next month, and then had a beautiful daughter a year after the first loss, and then had another daughter 2 years later. So on the back of having had a sad start to our family life, we then had two beautiful, healthy daughters. Eventually, I persuaded my husband that we should try and have a third child. I think that was part of what happened next. Was harder in some ways because it was very much me that wanted to have another baby. And although he was quite happy to have stuck at two, and I really didn't want to stop with two children. I wanted to have more than that, 'cause I love children, and it was something that I really wanted. And I was one of three and he was one of two, so I guess that also influences your family numbers. But when the girls were 4 and 2, I got pregnant again, and we were both absolutely delighted. I found out on Mother's Day that I was pregnant. At that point, I'd been doing a lot of running, and I went for a 12-mile run and found it a bit harder than I thought I should. And then the next day I thought, oh, wait a minute, and I did a pregnancy test, and that was sure enough, I was pregnant. So everything was fine. The first few weeks I actually had quite a lot of bleeding, and I couldn't get a scan on the NHS because it wasn't bad enough. So I went for a private scan at 7 weeks, and that was fine. Then I had my 12-week scan, and that was also fine. So we went on through that pregnancy without any concerns to start off with, although always knowing that not every pregnancy has a happy ending. Then as time went on, I started to realise that I wasn't as big as I had been with the girls, and because of the fibroids that I had, I was always really big, much bigger than you're meant to be for the weeks that you are. And I just, by the time I was sort of 17, 18 weeks, thought I should be a bit bigger than this. I'm not quite as big as I remember I would have been with the girls. And it was a wet summer. We were away on holiday in the Lake District. And I also realised that by the time I came back from holiday, my rain jacket wasn't quite as tight as it had been when we went away. So it was getting quite difficult to do up. And then I sort of realised that actually maybe it wasn't quite as tight as it was. I, at the same time, had delayed my 20-week scan slightly because we had a wedding to go to. And I was a tiny bit suspicious that there might be a problem, and I didn't want to know before the wedding, if that makes sense. We had to go down to Worcestershire, so we drove down there. It was my cousin's wedding, and came back. And again, the Tuesday afternoon after the wedding, went for my 20-week scan, and I was 21 and a bit weeks at that point. Again, it was across the meadows, and I went after work, took the afternoon off to go for it. Because I was a little bit worried, I walked across the meadows and I was already thinking, what am I going to put on my out of office reply if there's a problem? And I still remember every detail of it as well. A Tuesday afternoon's a bad memory for me at work. Anyway, we had a midwife appointment before the scan, and I said I'm a bit worried and I'm not quite as big as I thought it would have been. And she checked the heartbeat and said, oh no, I'm sure everything's fine. Anyway, so we went into the scan room, and because I've had 2 healthy children and I've had lots of scans with them, and I'm also medical, like you pick out on the ultrasound things that you spot. And straight away I spotted that the measurements weren't right. And I should have been 21 and a bit weeks. And I knew from the 12-week scan that date was accurate. And you can see at the top of the screen the estimated gestation by the measurements. And the baby was measuring about 18, 19 weeks, depending which bits they were measuring. And I was looking at it thinking that's really not right, because both the girls, even by 20 weeks, were a bit bigger than the gestation measurements. The sonographer was really lovely. She was quite vague, but in a very not so much vague as non-specific. So she straight away was clear that things weren't quite right, and that she wasn't quite sure why they weren't quite right. And I think that was really helpful, not to think, well, maybe it's going to be okay, but to actually say, I'm not sure what the problem is, but there definitely is a problem. So she looked at a lot of things. She specifically looked at the kidneys and bladder and couldn't really convince herself that she could see a bladder. Although at one point I think she thought she did, but she certainly couldn't see the kidneys. This was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I seem to remember. And she went away and came back and she said, I've made an appointment at fetal medicine 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. And the fact that we were being seen, like basically the next possible appointment, added to there's something really badly wrong here. So we went home and picked up the girls from nursery, spent too much time Googling. I was absolutely convinced that this was, going to be a very serious problem, and my husband was trying to be more optimistic, and he was Googling, trying to think of ways that this could be a happy ending scenario. And the other thing about the scan was there was hardly any fluid, and that's why my bump was really small, because there was basically no fluid there. So the next day we went to the Royal for the next scan and saw the fetal medicine consultant, who was pretty black and white, and when she looked at our baby told us that there was no chance this baby was going to survive. She said she couldn't tell what was wrong with it exactly, and we also, from the scan, because we asked, we couldn't find out the sex because they couldn't tell on the scan because of the malformations that there were. So we kept having to refer to the baby at that point as it, which was quite hard at that time, because obviously a scan where lots of people expect to find out the sex of their baby, and I wasn't going to, but since we were finding out everything else about it, I wanted to know. Anyway, so we were given the news that this baby wasn't going to survive, and I don't actually remember what they told us or what they gave us that day, except that they pretty much said they recommended that I should be induced and have the baby just then. There was a friend of mine who I knew, not in real life but online through a doctor's group, who had been through something similar a year or two before, and I knew that she'd stayed pregnant, and after a bad scan had continued the pregnancy until her baby died by itself. And I didn't know what I wanted to do in that scenario, and so we went away home without really a plan of what we were going to do. And at that point, I think we said we'd come back in a week, meet with the team again and think about more about what we were going to do. When we went home, we had the sort of day together, and then we had to pick the older two up from nursery. The older one was just about to start primary one. It was July, and she was due to start primary one a couple of weeks later. And I was thinking, how on earth can I help her start school whilst I'm pregnant with a baby who's not going to live? Sorry. So we made an appointment to go back the next day. I phoned them back, and I have to say they were very helpful. They said, yes, come back tomorrow morning. So we went back the next morning and had to think about all the practicalities about what might happen. The other thing about my baby Callum, who turned out to be a boy, so we called him Callum. I never felt him move, and by 21, 22 weeks, certainly I felt the girls move for a long time. So one of the things that was difficult was not knowing exactly, whether he was still alive at any point. So we made a plan that I'd probably be induced the following week. And I spoke to a lot of people, friends, mostly doctor friends online, rather than real life friends, about it all. At that point, there wasn't any support offered about how to cope with that whole decision-making process. I certainly don't remember any. I might have been given a leaflet for ARC, or I might have been told about that by somebody else, by my friends who'd had baby girl a few years before. I did have lots of support from one of my very best friends from being a student, who'd had a term stillbirth a few years before, and she was away in Aberdeen, but she was extremely supportive and helpful, and gave me some suggestions about, if we did go down the being induced route, things that we might do to make sort of memories and how it might be. So eventually we decided we'd go away for the weekend. We didn't go away for the night, but we went to a music festival, saw the Proclaimers, which is a big part of our family, and he was still there with us. So we had like a last family weekend of us all being there. And then on the Sunday morning, went into the Royal Infirmary and had the first tablet, and then went back on the Tuesday, and then he was born in the afternoon. When he was born, we still couldn't just find out what sex he was, because a big part of the syndrome that he had meant his genitals were ambiguous, so it was very difficult to tell. And I didn't want to be told the wrong thing, so the midwives were very clear that they weren't sure, and I said that's fine. I didn't want to know until we were sure, because I didn't want to give him a name that was the wrong sex. After he was born, we spent a few hours with him, spoke to him, and I kind of wish we'd stayed longer, but you never want to stay in hospital. My husband was desperate to get out of there, so we left in the evening, and one of the hardest things is I forgot to kiss him goodbye. Because you don't get another chance. And one of the other things that I regret a lot is that we didn't get hand or footprints done for him, because we got some beautiful photos though, but we noticed straight away that he had 6 fingers and 6 toes on each hand and foot, and I thought it would look a bit strange. So they offered us hands and footprints, but I said no, and you don't get the other chance ever again. So I wish on the day that the staff looking after you were a little bit more, I wish they didn't give you so many choices, because I think on the day you have your baby, knowing that there's not going to be a happy ending, you don't know what you want at all, and I think it's very hard to make choices in that situation. And there's some things that they have to get your permission for, like such as doing a post-mortem, but other things you don't know what you want in that scenario, and they give you too many options, I think. After we had him, we had a lot of support initially during that admission from the same consultant who'd looked after us in all my other pregnancies as well. We're very, very lucky that we met him the first time I was pregnant that didn't have a happy ending as well. And then he looked after us through both my daughter's pregnancies, and he's someone who really understands me well. Although he's not a fetal medicine consultant, he came to see us on the ward afterwards and arranged to see us again later, and I'm really grateful for that, because having his contact made it was really important, because nobody got in touch with us afterwards to check how we were. I think we were given a leaflet somewhere along the lines of mixed in with the post-mortem request form and all that kind of stuff. You get some kind of leaflet about sans Lothians, I think, but there wasn't any verbal contact or follow-up afterwards. There was an appointment made for several weeks later, but not anything about how to get support. I remember wandering around Edinburgh, it was during the festival, wandering around feeling completely isolated, like I'd stopped still in a wee world of my own, and the whole rest of the world was carrying on at its usual pace, and I just felt in a separate kind of bubble that something so huge had happened to us and that nobody else around knew anything about it. My husband was off work for 2 or 3 days and then went back to work, and I was there wondering what on earth I was going to do. And I came across the SANS UK forum online, and I wasn't sure, because of what had happened to us and because of the way our baby had died, I wasn't sure whether I belonged in a SANS type support network, because my idea of stillbirth or pregnancy loss is well, I knew it happened, but it's not what I thought SANS was about. But through the SANS UK forum, I realised that actually that was okay. And then I also knew that sans Lothian existed, but I didn't quite know exactly what they did. I live quite close to the shop in Clark Street, and I used to drive past it, and so I knew that there was a sans Lothian separate group, and it's a bit confusing when you first go on the SANS UK forum. It's not quite clear that sans Lothian is a separate entity, but eventually I worked that out, and one of the things that came about from that was joining the sans Lothian Facebook group. For quite a while immediately afterwards, and obviously still now, I found it really difficult to talk out loud, because I just started to cry, and I didn't want to go to a group. I didn't want to have to speak, because every time I tried, I just couldn't do it. So I found online support easier, because you can be in floods of tears, but you can still type. And on something like Facebook, there's always somebody there. Eventually, after about a year, I've decided I'd come to an actual group, because I wanted to talk out loud. And I think, Nicola, you were there. And there wasn't anybody else. It was me and you and Pamela, I think. And I realised that it was okay, and that other people accepted that if you've been in the situation of having to make a choice about your pregnancy, you're still included in support, and it's not something that's judged. And I think that's really important, because nobody chooses that, really. Nobody wants their baby to die. We were told our baby wasn't going to survive, and we didn't know how long he might survive for in utero, but we were pretty much told there was no way he would survive to be born, and he wouldn't survive probably much longer, because of his kidneys, the main thing. One thing, well, eventually after his post-mortem, we still didn't know what the underlying diagnosis was, and the obstetric team referred us to the genetics department at the Western. And so we saw a consultant there who thought she worked out what the syndrome was, and so sent away some samples to be tested, and found that Callum had an inherited disorder that was 1 in 4 chance happening anytime we were pregnant. Because after he was born, I'd been Googling like mad again. I'd realised that was a possibility, but none of all the things that he had wrong with him, which were many, many, numerous things, didn't quite fit into any syndrome that I could Google. But I had realised that there might be a chance it was something inherited. But because we'd had 2 healthy children, and because the first tiny baby had died from a virus, I kind of thought, well, it's less likely, because we've made, our other babies that we've made haven't had anything. But that's a totally naive way of looking at it, because it's just random each time. It's 1 in 4 each time. So just because you could have had 8 children already and not know about it. But once we knew about that diagnosis, made it even more of a sort of crazy thing in my head, because I was like, well, we've got 2 children, that's amazing. And at the same time, feeling guilty for feeling sad that we'd lost another one. But at the same time, underneath it all, really wanting to have another baby, but also not really being brave enough to think about that as a possibility. So for about a year, I decided that that was it. We weren't going to have any more. But I really felt like that wasn't my choice. It's not what I wanted, but it's what was the right thing. But actually, after I came to the first Sans Lothian group, something, I think maybe it helped. Maybe it was just the fact that it was with time, or maybe it just helped to know that other people were here and had survived. Then we did decide to try again. I did get pregnant again quite quickly. We're lucky with that aspect. That pregnancy, we went for an early scan because we were then under fetal medicine, and unfortunately there was just a sac developing and not a baby. Partly because I was kind of half expecting it that time. It didn't feel like such a that wasn't a surprise, put it like that. But it also made me really sure that I wanted to try again, and that wasn't us done. So again, shortly after that, I got pregnant again. And again, we went through the fetal medicine tests to start off with. So I didn't want to have any invasive testing, although we could have had a CVS or an amniocentesis to look for the gene. I didn't want to take the risk of losing that baby by the procedure, so we didn't do that. We went for more scans, and I also had a friend that I'd met online whose baby didn't have the same syndrome, but her consultant in London had wondered if they did, and had found out about a urine test you could do. So I told the geneticist about it and the obstetricians, who found out more about it and agreed that it was something that might be quite helpful. So we had a lot of extra tests, a lot of extra scans. We did the urine test, and at 16 weeks we found out that that baby was probably all right. But I didn't believe it at all till we saw her. And this is where my experience with Sans Lothians was even more important to me. That when I was pregnant with her, I was so stressed. For the first few months, we didn't know that this baby was going to be all right, and it was the first baby that we'd chosen to create, knowing that there was a high chance that it wasn't going to be okay. And by the time we had her, I was 40, so there's so many other things that come into your head about the risks of having a baby when you're a bit older. So I had support from online, and also from the pregnancy support group here. I also was offered support from my consultant, who saw me very frequently, which I'm very grateful for. Again, the same lovely man, who wanted to refer me to a psychologist. But I told him I was having support from Sans Lothians, and that was what I wanted, because I couldn't really see that a psychologist was going to make any difference, because all I needed was to have the baby at the end, and nobody was going to tell me everything was going to be okay until I knew it was. And all the way through that pregnancy, I was completely stressed. And looking back, at the time, I didn't realise how bad it was, and I was a pretty awful person to some of the people who are close to me, just because I was so worried and stressed about what was going to happen in the end. And we were very lucky. We had a third healthy daughter, so now we've got three beautiful girls. When I was pregnant with her, I absolutely knew right from the very beginning, even though after the miscarriage before her, I knew that I had to try again. As soon as I got pregnant the last time, I knew that was it, and that was the last time, no matter what happened. Straight away, partly the stress of it, I think, I knew I couldn't do that again. And even if that baby had been affected by the same syndrome, there was no way I was going to have another try. So I arranged to get sterilised when I had my caesarean with her, and my consultant, who's very understanding, put a date in the diary straight away at 16 weeks, because he totally got it. Anyway, so she's definitely our last baby, but we're very, very lucky to have the girls we've got. One of the other aspects that I think is helpful with Sans Lothians to me and my family is that it's a charity that supports the whole family. My husband hasn't really been to many things, but my children have been to some of the family events, and I think that it's been important to me all along to be honest with them about what's been happening and about pregnancy and losing pregnancies. So it's been difficult to support them because they were very young and they're growing up, to try and explain to them everything. And some of the events that Sans Lothians have helped to put that in a more concrete way for them, like balloon release and coming to the family day that there was last year. I think those have been very helpful. So looking after children after losses is another aspect that Sans Lothian supports. Of the things that I wish were different, obviously I wish that nobody had to be here, but I wish that the hospital gave you more almost friendly support in the right direction, because I think handing you a piece of paper in amongst a whole bundle of other stuff isn't enough. And when you're broken, you need somebody to give you a hug, whether that's a virtual hug or a real life hug. And people who haven't been in that situation don't understand. Like my family, not so much my husband, but to a little bit extent him, but more my parents, they just kept telling me I was depressed and I should get counselling or go and see a doctor after a few weeks when I was still feeling really sad. And I needed people to understand that it was a big grief, and I realised there's an overlap between depression and grief, but it's not the same. And you can what coming to somewhere like Sans Lothians does is realise that you're not on your own, and that other people understand that and accept that it's okay to feel sad. Obviously there is an overlap, and it's important to recognise when it isn't just grief, but that grief is not an illness. I think that's really important, a really important thing for people to know. The other thing that's important to me is that losing a baby kind of halfway through pregnancy is a huge loss, and I don't think people always recognise that. I think some people don't even realise that I'd had a baby. People asked me if I was going to be back at work the next day, and it's not as big as a full-term baby, but I still went through labour and had a small baby, and people are very ignorant about the actual physical side of it, never mind the mental side of it. And that's part of raising awareness, isn't it? To help people realise that a loss is hard no matter when. So we had our son at 22 weeks because he was diagnosed with complex abnormalities, and I was induced and had him. And because it was before 24 weeks and he was born sleeping, I wasn't entitled to maternity leave and I had to have sick leave. Never mind the physical recovery from giving birth even to a very small baby, the mental side of all of that was really difficult. And again, coming back to being given too many choices, I didn't feel like I had very good support about how long to stay off work or what to do, and I had to be off sick, so I had to go through my GP. I think it obviously depends what job you do, but I'm a children's doctor, and I have to work with babies and young children in very difficult situations, so it's not a straightforward job at the best of times. Sometimes I have to tell parents that their child's not going to survive, so that's not something that I felt able to do for a very long time. When I first went to my GP, he asked me how long I wanted to be off for. At that point, I had absolutely no idea how long I wanted to be off for. I don't know how you're expected to know that. And he signed me off for 2 weeks, and I kept having to go back every 2 weeks. And every time I went back, he seemed surprised that I didn't feel ready to go back to work yet. Somebody at my work suggested that I should come back after about 6 weeks because it would help with the department because it was very busy. And more people were going to be off. So I tried to go back after about 6 weeks and just was a complete disaster. I hadn't really processed things very well. I hadn't at that point had very much support. I'd been quite focused on trying to help my eldest daughter start primary 1 at school. So that was what my kind of focus had been, rather than letting myself work out what we were doing. At that point, we still hadn't even had the post-mortem results. We didn't know very much about anything. So I tried to go back to work, but the pressure of trying to be responsible for decisions about other people's children was just too much, and I couldn't do it. I survived that week at work. Just by the end of the week, I was so anxious about everything, not just work, but about everything in life. I couldn't even drive the car without I just couldn't do it without having a freak out. So I realised that I needed more time off. I still at that point didn't know how much longer I needed to be off, but I had to go and speak to my boss it was a Tuesday because it was a September holiday weekend, and say, look, I'm really sorry, but I just can't be at work at the moment. And they weren't particularly supportive, but agreed that I needed to be off. And I went back to my GP, who seemed amazed that I needed more time off, and then kept giving me 2 weeks again. So eventually, after another month, I kind of got my head around things a bit more. We'd had post-mortem results. I started doing the Capture Your Grief project, which was a really helpful thing to me, an online photo project, and it was a kind of way of doing counselling in a remote kind of way. It was about taking a photo, and each day there was a subject, and it related to your baby, and that was the first thing I did to kind of really work through things a bit, and it really helped. So having started that, I went back to work during October, and although I was back at work, it took a very, very long time before I was back doing all of my work. At least by the time I went back then, I was able to do some useful things. I didn't see patients in the ward very much to start with because I found that too difficult, and I didn't feel like I could support parents in difficulty. So I stuck to the easier things to do for quite a long time, and it probably took a year or more before I could do all the aspects of my job that I used to, maybe even longer, just because there were too many similarities sometimes, not direct similarities, but things that took me back to the difficult bits. Even now, a few years later, there was a day earlier this year where I was having to explain to a family about a very difficult diagnosis, and I was sitting there thinking, I'm here telling them that their son is in big trouble, and it just really reminded me of being on the other end of that conversation in a different kind of scenario. So I guess time made it easier, but one thing I wish at the beginning when I first gone off was that somebody had said, you need to be off for several weeks, don't even think about work for a while, whereas 2 weeks at a time is just not enough. 2 weeks comes round, and 2 weeks later you're like, oh, well, I've got to decide if I'm ready to go back, and it's not enough time to let yourself cry enough or get support in any way. So that's something I'd like to want people who have a termination for abnormalities. It's very often before 24 weeks, so it's a specific other area that will be a problem for a lot of people who've been through that because they can't have maternity leave. And it was something that a colleague who I don't really know very well had said to me, and I only know her online through a doctor's group, had said, you should wait till 24 weeks because then you'd at least be entitled to maternity leave. And I didn't really think about the implications of that because I thought, well, it's okay, I can have sick leave, that's not a problem. But the kind of uncertain duration of sick leave is really is a hard thing to cope with, and for other people to cope with as well, because if you have maternity leave, people expect you to be off for months, whereas sick leave, nobody knows how long that's going to be, and having little short bursts of it just think it makes that even harder. It's like you've got to justify the fact that you still need to be off as well, and that it's GPs that do that rather than the hospital. But even if the hospital could say, we'd expect you to be off for X amount of time, I realise it's individual and some people want to get back sooner, but that it takes a lot longer to get back to your focus than you'd think at the time, especially in a professional job where you've got to use your mind. I really found it difficult to focus on anything, never mind doing my job. It's 4.5 years, nearly 5 years since we had Callum, and over that time, I've realised that this isn't something that's ever going to go away from myself. Not that I want it to, but when you first lose your baby, you kind of expect that you're going to kind of get back to normal, and that's what people tell you to do. And you change, and I'm not sure I'd change what had happened to us because it's changed how I am as a person in lots of different ways. and it's made me do things that I wouldn't have otherwise done. It's changed me in how I am as a parent, and it's changed me in how I am as a doctor as well, because I work with children, and looking after those children, I realise how hard it is for their parents, even for the ones that we know are going to do all right. One of the things that became important to me was giving back something to the people who have supported me, and to try and help other people going through the same kind of thing. So last year, I did my first part of this befriending training for SANS, which was very interesting. I wasn't sure how it was going to be, and it was a very emotional weekend, but not in the way I thought it was going to be. It was a very positive experience, talking about how you support other people with similarly bereaved parents, how you support each other and newly bereaved people. One of the things that I'm very keen to do is to help Nicola from SANS Lothians in setting up more immediate and ongoing support for people who are faced with a difficult decision and after an abnormal scan or any other way of antenatal testing, because I don't think that how it was in 2012 gave me the right support. I don't think we had enough education about different options, and I don't think we were given the opportunity to speak to anybody else who'd been through a similar process. It's something I would very much like to help change, so that people, which this happens, all the time, every day, if somebody's going through this, I'd like to make people aware that there is support, because one of the things I was very scared about was approaching something like SANS for support, because I didn't know whether people who'd been in that situation were included in the support offered. And that's something that SANS Lothian is very all-inclusive for all pregnancy losses, that there's no nobody's left out. But I think when you've been through those kind of things, there's certain parts that it's difficult to share. And so one of the things that's happened over the past few months is the development of a separate group for people who've had a difficult choice to make. Because some things you might want to talk about would maybe upset other people, or might not feel as comfortable discussing in front of people who haven't been in that situation. So I think having the group is a really important addition to the support that SANS Lothians offers. Trying to get awareness and signposting to that support sooner would be would be amazing if we could do that. And I'd be very keen to help with that and offer support to somebody even before they've had their baby, because I think that would have made a big difference to me. Whether or not that's what people decide to do, I think it's such an emotional time that speaking to someone who's had to think about all the different options would help. And it doesn't have to be a verbal conversation out loud. It could be on Facebook or by text. Or by email. It doesn't have to be spoken, because it's such a difficult time to do all of that. I think that's it's a really important development, the link between SANS Lothian and ARC, and it's down to Nicola, so good for you.